Welcome to the Equity Expert Podcast. I'm Jen Namazi, and I'm the Director of Content for the NASPP. Today, I'm joined by our Executive Director, Barbara Baksa, in what is the fourth of a series of episodes that we have been doing covering some of the data, the trends and observations that have emerged from the NASPP and Deloitte 2020 Domestic Stock Plan Administration Survey. So really quick, before we get started, I just want to remind everybody that if you're listening to this episode and you're new to the podcast, it is part of our Equity Expert podcast series. The whole series features discussions on a variety of things, ranging from professional practices and trends and career-related topics in the area of stock compensation. The podcast is available on our NASPP website, naspp.com, and also in your streaming podcast apps like iTunes, Stitcher, and Spotify. So moving back to the topic of the day, I want to just take a moment to give some context because we are discussing data so that everybody kind of is clear on where the data is coming from. So the 2020 Domestic Stock Plan Administration Survey was developed jointly by the National Association of Stock Plan Professionals, NASPP, and Deloitte Consulting. And it provides a detailed look at the administrative practices of companies that are primarily headquartered in the United States. So topics covered in this particular survey cover, stock administration and communication practices, employee stock purchase plans, insider trading, and stock ownership guidelines. So today we're going to be covering stock ownership guidelines. And if you're interested in discussion on the other topics in the survey, those are covered in some of the other episodes in this podcast series. So with that, we're just going to jump right in. And Barb, thanks for joining me today.
Oh, thanks for having me. Glad to be here.
Yes, I know you love talking about the survey, and it's been really great having conversations about some of the data we've seen. So with respect to stock ownership guidelines, let's just kind of set the stage a little bit. I want to just start with the prevalence of these types of guidelines within organizations and what we're seeing there in the data from the survey.
Sure. So right now, stock ownership guidelines are very, very prevalent among the respondents to the survey, which are mostly publicly held companies. In the current survey, 85% of respondents have stock ownership guidelines, and that percentage has been steadily rising. We saw actually a really significant jump from the 2007 survey to the 2011 survey. We saw an increase of from 54% up to 73% in 2011. And then since then, the percentage has just continued to rise. And I have to believe that at some point we're going to be nearing 100% of public companies that have ownership guidelines. You can see in the current survey, 42% of the respondents that don't have 42% of the respondents that don't currently have ownership guidelines are considering implementing them within the next 3 years. That's also up in the last time we did the survey, so 2017, that was just 30% of the respondents that didn't have ownership guidelines. So I feel like we just have to be headed towards, we're going to be nearing 100% of publicly held companies have ownership guidelines at some point in the next, I guess within the next decade. Like it just seems like this just isn't something that you can exist as a public company and not have these guidelines for your executives.
Yeah, and it just, you can see the staying power of this type of guideline, right? It just seems to align everybody's interests so well, the organization, the executive, or the employee, and then the shareholders just kind of seem to all have similar interests there. So now...
And I think there's just so much pressure from shareholders, from the proxy advisory firms, and also from the media. Really, everyone who's focused on executive compensation is looking at how much skin in the game executives have and whether or not they own company stock. And certainly anytime executives transact in company stock, that gets really a lot of attention from both investors and the media. And oftentimes a lot of attention in the media, and I just think all of that is just creating just insurmountable pressure on public companies to have these ownership guidelines in place.
Yes. So one of the things that is interesting, I think, when it comes to this particular topic, ownership guidelines, is that there are some very strong practices, right? We see like large percentages of companies following a particular practice. And I think when it comes to, deciding on the guidelines, and you set a level for your executive or a target for them to meet in terms of their ownership guidelines, and then you have to figure out, the method you're going to use to support that, whether it's base salary or something else. So I wanted to just dive into the predominant method that companies are using to determine the level of their ownership guidelines.
Yeah, the majority of respondents, so 87%, tie their guidelines to a multiple or a percent of compensation. Usually it's expressed as a multiple. So for example, the CEO might be required to own 6 times his annual salary in company stock. And there are some other ways to do it, but really, some companies use like a lesser of a multiple or percent of salary and a set number of shares or just a set dollar value. But all of these other methods that you might use to establish ownership guidelines are used by only 5% or fewer of the respondents. So really the predominant practice here is to use a multiple or a percent of compensation. And then among those companies that are using a multiple or a percent of compensation, the predominant practice is to tie that to base salary. So there's all sorts of compensation that you can include in there, but 95% of companies just look at base salary. And I think that makes a lot of sense. It would be most of the other compensation that executives receive is going to be various forms of incentive compensation that vary or that are variable from year to year, and it's going to be very hard to tie ownership guidelines to a compensation amount that's variable. Base salary, sure, it probably increases every year, but it's pretty stable comparatively to their other forms of compensation, and so I think that's why you see really the overwhelming majority of companies tie their ownership guidelines to base salary.
So we're recording this episode in December of 2020, and as we know, this year in particular has been very uncertain and volatile in many ways. One of the areas where we have seen companies have some ups and downs is in stock price volatility, right? And so the kind of comes this question, which I think this year has been a great example of that, where there's an active question around, okay, now our stock price has, is volatile, or our stock price has dropped. How does that feed into the guidelines and things that companies would need to be considering there as an impact?
Yeah, that is an important question that I think companies have to address this year, particularly if their stock price is down. If the stock price is up, no one's having any trouble meeting the guidelines. But if the stock price is down, and if there was sort of a precipitous drop that is unexpected, and then the stock has stayed down, the question you have to ask is, well, now that if that drop has caused our executives to not be able to meet the ownership guidelines. So before that, they met the ownership guidelines, but now they don't. Not because they sold stock, but because the value of our stock has declined. Does it really make sense to require them to acquire a bunch of stock to bring their holdings back up to the guidelines? What we see in the survey is that companies, for the most part, evaluate their guidelines either just on a periodic basis as needed, that's around 60% of respondents, or annually, which is about a third of respondents. I don't know that a situation like this, where a company is experiencing stock price volatility that is maybe outside of the norm of what they would experience, is something that would trigger companies to change their guidelines. I think most companies are probably handling this year as an anomaly or on an exception basis. So maybe they're just giving executives a pass, basically, until the stock price stabilizes to meet the guidelines. It doesn't, if you're experiencing a lot of volatility, it doesn't really make sense to keep trying to adjust your guidelines as your stock price keeps moving around. You want to have like sort of a fixed target that your executives are trying to meet. You don't want the number of shares they need to own to just be constantly changing. So I think for this year, where companies are experiencing a lot of volatility, I think most companies are just saying, well, we're just going to hold off. Don't worry about it. We'll see where we're at the end of the year. We'll see what happens when the stock price stabilizes, and then we'll look at our guidelines and figure out if we need to adjust them. But for now, I think where companies have experienced a decline, I think most companies are probably just giving executives a pass in one form or another on complying with the guidelines until things stabilize.
And that seems like particularly reasonable considering, a lot of that is outside of the company specific control right now, right? So I could see
Yeah.
where there's more direct impact from the actions or the decisions of leadership, and then relative, to the stock price impact there, maybe having some more discussion or, reviews on those guidelines. But certainly the wait and see approach definitely seems to be warranted with what's going on with volatility now. So I think it's really important to context that stock price volatility, like you mentioned. Okay, so there comes the question as to, what do companies count for purposes of, like, what's considered a stock holding for purposes of meeting the ownership guidelines versus what doesn't get included. And in our world of equity compensation, there's a number of different types of awards or vehicles that we have. And so let's just walk through what we're seeing in terms of the types of equity that are included or excluded from those guideline calculations.
Sure. It probably goes without saying that any stock that the executives own outright will count towards the guidelines. So common stock that they hold in their name or that they hold in a brokerage account, that's obviously going to count towards the guidelines. But as you say, there are all sorts of other ways that they might have stock that they sort of quasi-own, or maybe they're going to have a right to acquire in the future. And the question becomes, should those shares count towards the guidelines? And we see practices vary pretty considerably depending upon we see practices vary pretty considerably depending on the arrangement. And really, I think it comes down to how close are they to actually owning that stock outright. So for example, if I look at vested phantom stock or deferred stock units, so this would be stock that's vested, the executive clearly has a right to it, it just hasn't been paid out yet because it's subject to some sort of deferral arrangement. Well, 92% of respondents would count that towards their guidelines. And I think that makes a lot of sense. The executives really, really have earned that stock and they own it, and the only thing that prevents it from being in their name directly is just that it hasn't been paid out. Shares owned indirectly by a trust or family member, 81% of respondents would count that towards the guidelines. That probably makes a fair amount of sense as well. As well as sort of other arrangements where the stock is vested are likely to count towards the guidelines. So vested shares in a 401k plan, vested shares held in an ESOP. But when you get into arrangements where the shares are unvested, those are a little bit less likely to count towards the guidelines. So if I look at unvested restricted stock or unvested phantom stock or RSUs, only 76% of companies would count those towards the guidelines compared to the 92% for the ones that were vested but deferred. If we look at performance shares, if those haven't vested yet, only 33% of companies would count those towards the guidelines, which I think that makes a lot of sense. If they're unvested performance shares, they have a ways to go to being able to really consider those shares earned and consider them shares that they have a right to, because there's probably both some time vested requirements they have to meet as well as the performance conditions. Likewise, unvested shares in a 401k or in an ESPP, only around 60% of respondents would count those towards the guidelines. When we get to stock options, now stock options are a whole separate ball of wax because there's so many different ways that they could count them. I will say the majority of respondents do not count stock options. It's well over a little over 60%, probably actually closer to 70% of respondents indicate that they don't count stock options towards the guidelines, or they indicated that they only count them after they've been exercised, which is really the same thing as not counting. Once an option is exercised, it's not an option anymore. So if you only count it after it's been exercised, you're not really counting a stock option towards the guideline. So that accounts for around 70% of respondents. The other sort of 30%, Practices vary. I think the most common is to count only vested in the money options, which that probably makes the most amount of sense because the vested options are the ones that the executive would have the right to. They could, there's the only thing that's preventing the executive from owning that stock is the fact that they themselves have not chosen to exercise the option. And if it's in the money, it's likely that at some point they would choose to exercise the option. But there's you could count vested whether or not they're in the money. You could count both vested and unvested. You could count just a percentage of vested in the money. There's lots of different things that you could do here. There's not really any, other than counting vested in the money, which works out to be 12% of respondents. There's not really any predominant practice here. And even 12% is not really predominant. The predominant practice is to not count stock options.
All right. So the last point we want to hit on is really the time frame to meet the stock ownership guidelines. So those, when the company sets forth the guidelines to the employee, it's not necessarily overnight that they're going to have to meet that, probably not even within months. So let's talk through what are we seeing in terms of how long companies are giving their employees to meet those guidelines.
This is another area where we do see some consolidation of practice. Really, it seems like 5 years is the most common. If companies are going to give executives sort of a set period of time in which they have to meet the guidelines, it's almost always 5 years. That's 62% of the respondents, which you might say, well, Barb, 62%, that's not even 2/3. But there's 20% that don't put a time frame on it, but just restrict executives from selling stock until they meet the guidelines. So between those two, the 62% that choose 5 years and the 20% that just say, we don't care when you meet them, but you can't sell any stock until you've met them, that accounts for 82% of respondents. And the other 18% are sort of just all over the place. There's not really 3 years. I guess there's 10% that say 3 years. That's a pretty distant second to 5 years, and then everything else is pretty much just all over the place.
All right. Well, I think this hits on the high points of where we wanted to go in terms of highlighting some of the data we're seeing from the survey today. So, Barb, I want to thank you for joining us.
Oh, thanks for having me. Thanks for, I know this has been a series of podcasts we've done. I've really enjoyed it, and thanks for letting me highlight the data that we have in the survey. I think the survey is one of the most valuable benefits that we offer NASPP members. I hope that everyone who is listening to the podcast participates in the survey. If you haven't participated in the past, I certainly hope you see the value in it after listening to these podcasts, and you'll participate in the future. And I really appreciate, Jen, the opportunity to have highlighted some of this data.
Well, and I agree, it's such valuable data. And for those who are looking for more information about the survey, I want to point you to a couple of things. So NASPP members can access a full webcast that we did in October of 2020 on the survey. That is available as part of your NASPP membership. It's in the education section of our website, so you can go there to get even more information. As Barb mentioned, we do have full results of the survey now available. That is to qualifying NASPP members, and for more information about that, you can also find that on our website, naspp.com. You can go to our research center and then look for the surveys section. And then lastly, if you enjoyed this podcast and some of the other episodes as well, we encourage you to subscribe to the podcast series. You can do that through our website, naspp.com/podcasts with an S. Otherwise, you can also do it through your streaming apps. You will get notified when new episodes are available, so we encourage you to do that to stay up to date on the most recent information that we're putting out there from the NASPP through this format. So thank you for joining us, and we will see you all on the next episode.